I promised last time not to talk about the major theme of redemption, reconciliation, and forgiveness, but I do want to just say, if you go back to Prospero's first speech, curiously, the allegory, the Christian allegory, does start there. And many commentators have talked about the number of Christian terms. And I just thought I would say very simply, he sounds like Yahweh at the beginning. He almost says, I am what I am. And he does sound like the God of the Old Testament. And this continues. So I think there is an allegory about the king, the divine right of kings, the leader of the country being a kind of patriarchal God. And there are Christian terms that continue throughout the play, which culminate in mentioning prayer and mercy in the epilogue. I think there are a series of interesting intellectual, almost jokes involved here, because since kingship in Europe is predicated on Christianity, and that the king is the link between God and the people, he's placed there by God. Curiously, Shakespeare has a number of interesting refractions and reflections based on Prospero's triple function as playwright, author of the magic and the drama, as king, and as God who has a magical power to affect transformations in people. We see a process, a religious process of repentance and forgiveness. Some of the people do reform and some don't. These three functions, therefore, refract upon one another in interesting ways. Do you believe a king is godlike? Do we invest in a king the power of a Yahweh of the Old Testament? Certainly in my last lecture, I talked about the rather harsh and brutal side of kings, and how, if you look at the Old Testament, you'll see that God is quite as angry as Prospero quite often in the Old Testament when the chosen people go astray. I think all the elements for the possibilities of rehabilitation, repentance, reconciliation, and forgiveness are there, but also the realistic perception by Shakespeare of the difficulties of making it all work in a society where everybody wants to be happy and everybody wants to fulfill desire. I won't say any more about that subject, but I'll go straight on to drama and the theatre. As everybody knows, this is Shakespeare's final play. In lots of ways, it's set up for the audience to reflect upon Shakespeare's last outing as a dramatist. In a way, you might see it as the arrow that he shoots into eternity, the tip of his fame, and that all of the other plays stream behind him, which is why I think so many of the other plays are referenced. It also has a complex structure. I've said, as my own personal interpretation, that I feel the first scene with the ship and the last scene with the epilogue give the effect of a play within a play, but even within that play, there is another play within a play, and that is The Mask, that he presents for the celebration of the engagement of Ferdinand and Miranda. And rather strangely, I'm going to start there. Shakespeare, the dramatist, may want to talk about the nature of dramatic art, but he also was living in that culture, and he wants to talk about actors acting, and he wants to have a pot shot at his rivals. Those of you who have read Hamlet, the other great play which is about contemporary theatre, will know that it wasn't all rosy, it was a little bit cutthroat. Actors used to leave your company, remember the bit they had in your play, write it down for the other company, and then they'd put on Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet or Ethel the Pirate, and you would be in trouble. But there was one big difference. Shakespeare was in a public company. They performed in public theatres for the public. But there was a very different kind of theatrical company. They used much younger players, often young men and adolescents. They played in private houses and for private gatherings of aristocrats. That kind of company presented things that were more literary, were more based on the classics, that were more rarefied, refined. Well, of course, nothing's more refined than Shakespeare, but they were pitched at a particular audience. They were more masque-like than public play-like. They tended, at the end of Shakespeare's career, to become more and more masque-like, and you'll know Purcell's masks. In this period it's developing, and it's chiefly this kind of company that is taking this on. I have some interesting worksheets on this if you would like more information, but you don't want to get away from the play in your exam, because you have to give a concentrated effort. You will know that in the Paris ballet in the 19th century, often the ballerinas had patrons. We are talking about a Julia Roberts Pretty Woman situation, and Shakespeare in Hamlet, and here in this play, is perhaps taking potshots at perhaps the slightly seedy world of his rivals, these young boys who perform, and they often performed as goddesses and looked quite attractive on stage, and they had their patrons. Which leads me to the question of why the masque is so bad. Horror. Am I allowed to say that? It's bad, isn't it? This is the world's greatest dramatist. He could have written the world's greatest masque, couldn't he? But he didn't. Ceres and Iris and Juno, the poetry that they speak is very typical. It's pastoral, it's classical, it's refined, and it's rather dull. It's also, from time to time, rather ridiculous. The words themselves, spongy and so on. He could have written the world's best masque. Why didn't he? Because it's a parody of his rivals. It's a parody of the sort of refined masque that the private companies were putting on. And Shakespeare perhaps is here in his last play, giving one last kick at a tendency which he thinks is perhaps regrettable. He began his career many years before in a different kind of world, when plays were public, when people like Marlowe and Kidd were alive, and he's finishing in a world where the theatre is drifting towards the kind of patronage that King James and his friends, like Buckingham, could offer. The masque ends rather strangely. It's rather chaste, it's rather cold, and it plays on Elizabethan theories of humours, and it ends rather abruptly after a dance. You all know the last lines of the masque: your rye straw hats put on, and these fresh nymphs encounter everyone in country footing. I don't need to point out encounter and footing. If you know your French, these are two bawdy jokes. And of course, when the men come on and dance with the women, it's kind of a representation of earthy sexuality, which is, of course, entirely appropriate for a wedding masque, but in another way might be one of Shakespeare's many little jokes here, that the masks may have seemed to have been rather classical and chaste, but they had that kind of strange mix of sexiness that you would get in a stately old house where the boys are performing in very close proximity to the aristocratic audience who are sitting on lovely chairs right near them. It's rather different from a public performance. They dance for a little bit, and then Prospero starts suddenly and speaks, after which, to a strange hollow and confused noise, they heavily vanish. I'm not really sure. Was that the real end of the masque? It was really, because it ended in a dance with a kind of sexual consummation, as was appropriate. But the way he starts, jumps up, and the strange noise happens, you do feel that he's called a halt to it in a strange way. Also, you'll all realise it goes straight back to the shipwreck. Right here in the middle of the play, we have another confused and hollow sound, and something is cut off. The ship sinks, we think. The masque sinks. Why has he brought us back with this strange noise to the beginning of the play? And why is he so depressed? His aside tells us that his mind has been brought back to the conspiracy, of Caliban and his confederates. The minute has come and he must do something. I think you can see Shakespeare is probably showing a process, and he's answering the question I posed on Wednesday. Does Prospero move on? Does Prospero learn something? The audience heard in scene 1. He may have been Yahweh-like, but when he was Milon, he lost his kingdom through being a bad leader. Here, we have a picture of a leader watching a lovely mask, and what does he do? When the time comes to act, he acts. He stops the mask, he turns away from his private world of art and mask-like beauty, and he takes the reins and does something to stop the conspiracy. It is, in a sense, an answer to the questions that Shakespeare has been posing about him. Prospero is prospering. He is speeding. That's what the word means. He is succeeding in being a proper leader. However, he's still Mr. Angry, isn't he? Except here, it's a very strange mix and a strange mood. If you could all have it open at Act 4, Scene 1, just after the mask. Ferdinand says, "Your father's in some passion that works him strongly. Never till this day saw I him touched with anger so distempered." And we've seen him very angry, and then what comes out of his mouth? Not anger at all. A profound, brooding sadness. How would you describe it? "You do look, my son, in a moved sort, as if you were dismayed. Be cheerful, sir, our revels now are ended. These our actors, as I have foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherits shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a wreck behind. So I am vexed." And he suddenly sounds very old. He talks about his infirmity. What's going on? Where is the profound sadness? Is it personal? Of course it is. Everybody who goes to the play sees it as Shakespeare talking. Maria Callas, Horowitz, do they all keep going to the end of their lives? Pianists are lucky, aren't they? But great artists have that moment when they have to give up. And it must be very hard to give up being the best at something, to be the greatest in the world at something, and to give it up. So partly there is an intense personal element to this in which Shakespeare has to give up the greatest thing in his life. It's also, in a way, a kind of epic boast, as you would get from Virgil or Homer, because Shakespeare, in a sense, is bragging that he outdoes Virgil and Homer, because he not only writes a poem, he presents a dramatic poem. It's a double thing. The poem is always there on the page, but the performance is a thing that really transforms people who are sitting in front of it. It's like music in that sense. It has a kind of duality. It's not Jane Austen or Dickens. It's a public thing, a public experience, and was at the center of Greek culture. His brag here is rather touching and rather sad. What does he say? Obviously, the mask we've just seen was not gorgeous, cloud-capped, solemn, the great globe itself. We didn't get that, did we? But what is he talking about? His own oeuvre, all of the plays that he's written. And there is this sense of sadness that they are now melted into thin air. The spirits, of course, are the actors, and they've all disappeared. Art, is it as insubstantial as this speech suggests? Is Shakespeare's achievement baseless? You can see the little joke, the great globe itself. He's, of course, referring to his own theatre. But the list of things he mentions, the fabric, the towers, the palaces, the temples, and the great globe, you might think, interestingly, cover all of the social and religious bases, cover all of nature, art, and humanity. It will all dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant, the mask you've just seen, and that may be a little joke, because I think he thinks that the masks probably were, this is just my personal interpretation, insubstantial pageants rather than great art. Leave not a wreck behind. Well, how do you see that word wreck? It has a lot of meanings, doesn't it? But it has this marvelous idea that when you go out of a theatre, what's left? He's picturing all of these things as clouds, and when the clouds go, there's not even a wreck behind. But what wreck is left? Clouds are white, and I always imagine, and this may be a personal thing, what is left are the words on the page. There are two things that Shakespeare does in a way that just a poet or a novelist doesn't. He has the book, the white page with the wreck on it, all of the words, but he also has the millions of people who have been in the theatre to experience the play. Does it all go? Does it matter? Does Mozart matter? Does Leonardo da Vinci matter? Does Shakespeare matter? Is it just art? And this, of course, is where suddenly you realize, if you haven't before, that we are dealing with all kinds of ways in which magic might transform people, political magic, the magic of great spiritual doctrines which bring forth repentance, forgiveness, reconciliation, mercy, pity, peace, and love, as Blake would say. The three areas of the play all overlap, I feel, on this great hinge moment where he makes this speech. What kind of magic can make the world better? Can a play be as important as an Act of Parliament, a great institution like the church? Does this play answer the question? Well, I think in a way it does. Is it answered here in this speech? No, it goes to a moment of extremely poignant sadness. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. So how do you really make an influence in the world? How do you make the life of Caliban better? Does Shakespeare matter? Is this an admission of failure? It's only a kind of 2/3 of the way through the play point, but does Shakespeare answer this question by the end of the play? I think in a way, extraordinarily, he does. How many people also feel that you get an answer about the value of art, about what magic can be done? It's an airy-fairy play, but I think he really manages to do it. Sir, I am vexed, bear with my weakness, my old brain is troubled, be not disturbed with my infirmity, and he turns to other things. I did mention before that, in a way, we are in the world of triads, Lucy, aren't we? That you have Plato with his charioteer and the two horses. We have Freud with the id, the ego, and the superego. We have the mind, the spirit, and the body. I don't know why great psychological, philosophical, and religious theories often present the self in terms of three, and that's what you're given in this play. Shakespeare, Ariel, and Caliban. I've already said, Prospero is Shakespeare. Prospero is also, would you call it the will? The intellect? Ariel, the imagination, and Caliban, I said on Wednesday, represents the real life of desire, I suppose, that the sensual desire of us all to be happy and live a good life. How does Shakespeare integrate these three elements in the play? How does the allegory of the play represent how these three things work to create great art? Interestingly, he has magic objects, doesn't he? What does he have? He has a cloak, a staff, and a book. What did the book represent? Well, I think we all know. We had it in the Duffy poem, didn't we? If you're going to be a great poet, you've got to have the book. You have to have read what other great poets. Prospero's study does involve dramatically what Shakespeare is saying about his education. It's in a way an answer to those people who said he was a kind of wild child. People like Johnson were the real classicists. How did Shakespeare, the great genius, manage to come up with these things when he didn't read Greek? Well, the funny thing is, what does he say about the book? He's going to drown it and, deeper than plummet. What does he say? No one is going to find this book. I think it's a little joke, a personal joke, isn't it? You can't be Shakespeare. Good luck, Ben Jonson, with all your classical knowledge and your copies of Terence and Plautus, but my book is going to be buried, curiously. The staff and the cloak. what are they? As with Hamlet, I think the staff and the cloak represent that knowledge that Shakespeare had above all others, and that's, of course, the stagecraft. There are a whole series of jokes in Hamlet and in this play about stagecraft. I think we don't have the keys anymore. We don't exactly know, because his audience is looking at the actors who did these things, the same actors who probably incarnated King Lear and Coriolanus and Lady Macbeth. They're probably on the stage in front of them. And his faithful audience, can you imagine, you'd been to Shakespeare Theatre and you had seen all his plays. You'd been there for 30 years from the beginning. Wouldn't it have been amazing? And you were there on the opening night of his final play. So you are part of that tradition. You are part of the tradition as well, aren't you? Because there are famous pianists and famous violinists who pass on their teaching and it comes to you. You are part of performance traditions. And those performance traditions Shakespeare jokes about in the earlier acts of Hamlet. And in this play, I think there are a whole series of stage directions that he gives to the spirits that the audience would realize. There may be references to things done in other plays. For example, when the curtain goes back in the atrium behind the stage and Miranda and Ferdinand are shown playing at chess. There's a whole play called A Game of Chess. So Shakespeare is discussing stagecraft and the theatre, and that reaches its key moment when he has them spellbound in the charmed circle, because that shows Shakespeare's stagecraft in the sense that he magically and symbolically presents how Shakespeare is the controlling wizard with all of them stopped on stage. He can start them for you to see. He is the controlling master of the stage. So I wish I could lecture you about that, but I'm afraid I'm not an expert on Elizabethan stagecraft, but there are many hints in the play that he is talking about those sorts of things. Do you know earlier in the play he makes that wonderful speech where he talks about his magic and mushrooms and the stemming tide and Neptune and leaping about, and he can take a pine off a promontory? It does represent the great joy and delight of Shakespeare being able to create. And what does he do? He creates on stage. What was the stage like? Compared to a modern stage, it was primitive and difficult. That's why I think there's a great joke when Ariel talks about being St. Elmo's fire. He comes on and says, I flamed along the bowsprits. I was this special kind of lightning, and he describes it all. Shakespeare recreates the scene for us in words. Why is Shakespeare the greatest poet who's ever lived? Because Shakespeare can create it in words, but as a dramatist, he can also do it. And if you're going to complain that, oh, he only described in words that scene, we didn't actually see the St. Elmo's fire go across the bowsprit, what's Shakespeare going to say? Hey, I gave you a shipwreck in the first scene. I think there are a number of jokes in which this play looks at Shakespeare's stagecraft, and you can see a similar thing in his depiction of the island. One person sees it as a burnt desert place covered in firs. Gonzalo sees it as having lovely springs and as being green and fresh. What is the nature of nature? Well, Shakespeare, in presenting the drama, can create a world of nature which influences how we see nature. Would Keats' poetry be possible without Shakespeare? I don't think so, but I'm going to come back to that a bit later. The nature of the island is very strange. It's supposed to be a Mediterranean island, which prefigures a Caribbean island. If you read Marvell's poem from a bit later about the Bermudas, it's got oranges and tropical things in it. It's wonderful. And in the garden there are melons, of course, from exotic climes. But in Shakespeare, what have we got? Clustering filberts and scammels. It's all decidedly British. There's not a palm tree to be seen. Could he have put a palm tree in? He could have done. Why is it so British? Because I think it's part of the joke. He's referring to his own stagecraft. This was his heritage, and this is what he is giving us. The nature of nature is recreated in the forest of Ardennes, in a Greek forest, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, a Scottish castle, a cliff at Dover. The great art of Shakespeare creates nature, and I think, as I'm going to argue a little bit later, the way we see nature, art, people, and society. At this point in the play, We feel perhaps sad for Shakespeare, and we wonder if he can tell us whether the pageant, the gorgeous pageant, is going to fade and not leave a wreck behind. So I'm going to cheat and just go straight to the end. What does he finally say? At the very end of Act 5, Scene 1, the hardest line in the play, every third thought shall be my grave. Did you think about the mathematics of that? People have argued it back and forth, and I don't think we've got time, but have a think about that. Alonso says your life would be very interesting. If you think of Prospero as Shakespeare, I think it's kind of a funny joke. Do we really care about Justin Bieber's life? No, it's his great art as a singer that we really care about. What do we know about Shakespeare? You're laughing, but I'm serious. Modern celebrity is very different from Elizabethan celebrity. We know nothing about Shakespeare, and as I've said to you so often, all these people who write 500-page books about the life of Shakespeare, there is very little in writing about him. So Shakespeare's life is going to end. He is going away. What does he say? I'll deliver all. Well, that's a great thing to say. Can you see how all the allegories come in on that one word, deliver? The Christian allegory, the idea that he's going to be a king who will finally deliver and look after his people and be a good king. And of course, did Shakespeare through, is it 36 plays or is it a bit more now? Did Shakespeare deliver? Well, more than any person who's ever lived. Shakespeare delivered, didn't he? I'll deliver all. But he'll also free us all. Can he make that stick? Do you feel delivered by Shakespeare? Well, I do. I'm going to argue a bit later that Shakespeare has created me. I don't want to make Shakespeare responsible for that, but I think Shakespeare, you're smiling already, he has created us all, hasn't he? So I think we're going to get an answer to left not a rack behind, because we're all a rack. I'll deliver all and promise you calm seas, auspicious gales, and sail so expeditious that you'll catch your royal fleet far off. Well, there are some final little political jokes about the royal fleet, aren't there? He keeps the satire going till the end. But I think it's very interesting. I could, in a banal way, say he has to say that because it's a comedy. You want a happy ending, don't you? But does he give us calm seas, auspicious gales, and sail? We started off with tempest and shipwreck, and this is what we have at the end. Is that true in life? No, but that's the great thing about art, isn't it? Finally, he says, my Ariel chick, that is thy charge. Then to the elements be free and fare thou well. Please you draw near. Of course, there was a famous production with Derek Jacobi in which he releases Ariel, but unfortunately Ariel's already gone. And it's rather poignant and sad because it's too late and he gestures, but Ariel has disappeared. Why is it so sad and why is it interesting? And even more importantly, where does Ariel go? He's not really in a cowslip's bell, is he? But he is. Have you noticed how many images of enclosure there are? The magic circle. He keeps talking about people's brains with the tide out or being full of water. There are symbols of circles and globes. An island, a globe, a play within a play. Everything is enclosed, and I think it kind of reverberates throughout the play. The circular symbolism comes back. Where's Ariel gone? He's gone into your globe. What are you watching the play with? 2 globes. I think brilliantly the symbolism of the play, and I'm sorry that's a whole different lecture, the symbolism of the play leads you forward to this final moment. The release of Ariel, he's not flitting about actually, he's gone into you. You are the imagination. And how do we make this stick? Well, we've got modern science. What happens when you have an experience, when you have to sit there, here through this boring lecture? What happens? Chemically in your brains. You might say that you remember something, and that's what Shakespeare's audience would have said, but a modern biochemist would say, actually, your body has changed. Things in your brain I don't know what they are because I don't know anything about biochemistry, things in your brain have actually changed. Everybody in this room can play every note of a complex series, and you know all of the movements. You could probably do it with your eyes closed, most of you. It's not just that you know these pieces of music, they're in your brain. Your brain has been changed by art. You've been transformed physically. There are many complex ways in which art actually makes you different. And now we get into the overlapping, the Christian allegory, the allegory of princes, and the allegory of art. Big question, do we have princes and kings because that's what society needs? Or do we have princes and kings because that's what Disneyland wants? Because that's what you have in fairy tales and literature? Do we base our lives on social things, or do we actually live the life of dreams? Our little lives are rounded by a sleep, but our little lives are created out of dreams. I asked you last time, did you want to be Ferdinand or Miranda? And you'll all say no, but you do really, don't you? All of the things you want to do in life, are they really determined purely by social concerns, or are they actually formed by spiritual concerns from religion, or, more crucially for us here, because this is our topic, from literature? Does not literature, the tropes, the modes, the forms, the desires, the structures, from your earliest time, from the cradle onwards, has not literature made you what you are? And in a bigger sense, does not literature make what you think the world should be like? Our whole notions of kings, of churches, of palaces, towers, temples and globes may actually be created more by Shakespeare than by David Cameron and Barack Obama. Shakespeare is a greater creator of everyone in this room than perhaps your mother and father? No, I can't claim that, can I? You're teenagers, so of course you're going to agree with me. You won't. 5 years on, you'll think mum and dad are great once you've gone to university. But it's the big question, isn't it? Does Shakespeare make a claim that, in a sense, the globe he gave, the island he gave, did change the world in a way that completely denies what he says 2/3 of the way through the play? Isn't it sad that I'm going to die, my art will go, and it will all fade and leave not a wreck behind? But there are so many ways in which you can argue that, no, what he created has changed the world. And I really do say, in all sincerity, I do think a lot of my behavior, the way I think about the world, my strongest beliefs are based on Shakespeare. Curiously, I also said I was going to come back to Keats because when Ariel leaves, when he gives it to the audience, he's also given all his plays. And although we have a number of jokes about burying his book, you're not going to find it, he does know, is he going to have children? You can argue, can't you, that really strange things are so related to Shakespeare. I always feel that the child of The Tempest is the magic flute. It has all the same elements and the same magic and wonder and the same strange possibilities of violence and cruelty. Does Shakespeare actually change the world through his imagination becoming part of a tradition which influences other artists? You can't write poetry in English without being influenced by Shakespeare. And so, in a sense, it's not only just the audience, it's the kind of literary, intellectual, cultural tradition that Ariel goes into and becomes part of. Not just a washing powder, but a living tradition across hundreds of years, and it keeps spreading and spreading. There are so many ways in which you can argue that Shakespeare is offering up in this play an answer to the value of art, not just an island, but when they all go back, when we all go back, when we leave the theatre, we have Ariel, and that's why I think that's where the play ends. Then to the elements be free and fare thou well. You might say he's saying it to Ariel, but since he's given us his greatest gift, his imagination, his stagecraft, And I'm afraid I didn't say much about Caliban, but I did so much in the last lesson. I'll just say quickly, the very beautiful speech Caliban makes, this sense of desire. Is there anyone more than Shakespeare that made you feel what it's like to be alive and human and want things or hate things or experience love or experience anything else? He, more than anyone else, is a great artist because it's not cold and intellectual, it's full of Caliban, a real earthy, rather disreputable, hideous rapist, but also this pitiable creature who wants to be happy. So the humanity in Shakespeare, I think, is part of the allegory that Shakespeare offers us up. It's Caliban and it's also Ariel. It's the intellect of Prospero with these other dimensions as well. So it's a complex allegory that's worked out, and I don't have time to show how all of these different stages in the play works out the allegory and how it overlaps with the other two themes about power and society. But you can refer to that in the exam, I think. Please you draw near. And then we get to the epilogue. The epilogue's strange, isn't it? Now my charms are all o'erthrown, and what strength I have's mine own. It's a funny little sing-song thing, but why is it so poignant and interesting? Is it just that we invest in it, the knowledge that Shakespeare is speaking to us for the final time, and you do feel, as Prospero, he's speaking in a very direct way? Are you disappointed by what's said? Yes and no. He finishes with, I want to be relieved by prayer, because his ending is despair. Is it infinitely sad? No, because what can he do now? He can buy a timeshare in Marbella. He can finally put his feet up. He can sit around and drink tequila shots, can't he? If we do what? If we release him, because he needs to be released. He's done enough. And he needs to be, and I think this is the most wonderful apologia, it's common for authors, Chaucer produces an apologia at the end of his work, to apologize for your work and to ask forgiveness for what you've had the audacity to offer the public. So he asks to be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. How many faults are in Shakespeare? Wow, people went on and on about it, didn't they? Shakespeare broke all the rules. Antony and Cleopatra takes about 5 years in real time to act out all around the Mediterranean. It's absolutely impossible. Is it one of the greatest plays ever written? Of course it is. Is it Shakespeare's little joke? Shakespeare's full of faults, and yet, na-na-na-na-na-na, his plays are better than anyone else's. You may feel that the little jokey side of Shakespeare keeps going right to the end, but it also does have this heartfelt plea, mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardoned be, let your indulgence set me free. And I think that incredible message is very interesting because it circles back all the way to what extent are you going to forgive Caliban, Antonio, Sebastian, Alonso? To what extent are you going to be fair? Are you going to go out of this play with the feeling that you are going to pardon, be indulgent, pray for other people, that you're going to be pierced by feelings of mercy, that you're going to free all faults of other people? He's asking that you do it for him. Why? Because if you can do it for Shakespeare, can you go out and be better? Is he really doing that? I think he really is. Do I feel like that? I do feel like that. Maybe I'm a child, but when you've seen King Lear, you come out, don't you feel better? You want to pat a dog on the head or, go and work in a homeless shelter? Don't you feel you're like a better person? Is that too childlike or childish? I don't think so. And at the end of this play, he says, if you'll just clap, if you'll agree with me, if you'll give it up and forgive me, you can go out and maybe free yourself with your indulgence, not judge harshly. I think it's a plea by being part of a contract with Shakespeare and the drama and the airy spirits to go out and transform it into a public place where you might actually be a better person. And what's the great part of the contract? It's applause, isn't it? Once you break the spell, and this is the third noise in the play. Have you noticed? The ship goes down, noise one. The masque ends with the horrible noise, but the third noise, I always feel, pays for all. The applause is the happy noise that's going to set us free, in a sense. Shakespeare, the end of his career, the actors, but maybe because we participate in the pleasure of seeing the play, perhaps we are in the third noise making up for the other two and doing something for ourselves. And now I'm sorry, I want to go backwards in his epilogue. He says, he no longer has strength. What strength I have's mine own, which is most faint. I think that's wonderful, because it's an epic boast, isn't it? What power do you have as a dramatist? As just an individual person, you have very little. It also continues the joke about Shakespeare being an actor as well as a playwright. Apparently he liked to be Hamlet's ghost, but we don't really know. He was both actor and playwright. So what is the strength of an actor to incarnate? But all of that's in the play. And what strength I have's mine own, which is most faint. Now it is true, and I also think it's about the lines on the page again, fading over time. What is the power of art? Now it is true, I must be here, confined by you or sent to Naples. I think this continues the allegory. What happens to Caliban? When they go back to the real world, will it work? Can you go away from a play and think, if the world were like this, what would I change and what would I do better? Shakespeare wrote how many history plays? You cannot look at all of Shakespeare's history plays without thinking about the way we run the world. More than any other dramatist, he talks about politics, government, power, and for me personally, above all, that killing people is always wrong. He seems to be very pertinently anti-violence. Or sent to Naples, let me not, since I have my dukedom got, and pardon the deceiver, dwell in this bare island in your spell. That's why I think he's not staying in Britain, he's going to Marbella. No, of course I'm joking. Dwell in this bare island by your spell, and release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. Gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails. Well, I always want to shed a tear when a good actor does this, because this is the greatest compliment you're ever going to get in your lives. If I say this play was wonderful, if I clap, if I show my appreciation, I have shown that I've participated. Shakespeare tells me, wow, I couldn't have done it without you. It's the humblest thing in the world. I needed you. I need you, your hands, your release, your gentle breath, or else my project fails, which was to please. More than any other artist anywhere in the world, Shakespeare has said it's a kind of contract. It's your breath, your hands. I've done this for you and with you. And you can imagine, I'm thinking again, Fiona, of those people who maybe over 30 years have been to all his plays. And it was really personal. Those people in the audience, you know, he had seen all of this time. And he's saying, I would not be Shakespeare if you had not participated with me. And I think the contract Shakespeare offers goes beyond. As long as you participate with your imaginations, because it doesn't work unless the audience participates, suspends disbelief, or whatever you want to say, as later commentators have said. But without this active participation between artist and world, artist and public, it won't work. I think it's a really strange piece of writing, because it looks like a little sing-song thing, da-dum, 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 but it's full of rather fascinatingly profound and complex interactions between art and audience, and offers many possibilities for us thinking about the power of art to change the world. I know I sound rather silly saying that, but as soon as you put it into words, it's very hard to find the right words to say how powerful this tiny little sing-song but beautiful poem at the end is. Shall I stop there about drama? I've done really well, I think. I haven't looked at the text very closely. Could I go back to the two other topics that I did want to talk about with these two passages? And next week I'll choose some other passage. Week after I'll choose some other passages. Can we look at Miranda and Ferdinand, our lovely fairy tale characters? Lucy, do you have to go? Well, here we have love, don't we? It's fairy tale, desert island love. Admired Miranda, indeed the top of admiration, worth what's dearest to the world. Full many a lady I have eyed with best regard, and many a time the harmony of their tongues hath into bondage brought my too diligent ear. For several virtues have I liked several women, never any with so full soul, but some defect in her did quarrel with the noblest grace she owed, and put it to the foil. But you, O you, so perfect and so peerless, are created of every creature's best. Well, what are you going to say? Would you be happy with this speech? Well, of course you would. After the world we live in, smiley heart, capital U, comma, babe, exclamation mark. That's probably what you get nowadays. Girls, would this be better? Susanna, you're cringing. Are you cringing because of the rhetoric? Yeah. But he's really trying hard to express his love, isn't he? There's something wrong with it. You know I'm going to say there's something wrong with it. You feel uncomfortable. Why? Because he's valuing her. He begins with admired Miranda, indeed the top of admiration, kind of corny pun. And then, of course, he moves to a commercial metaphor. Remember, commercial metaphors are very common at the time and not necessarily negative. Shakespeare uses them miraculously and wonderfully in the sonnets. Full many a lady I have eyed with best regard, and many a time the harmony of their tongues hath into bondage brought my too diligent ear. Well, what do we learn? He's a lover, isn't he? He's seen all the prettiest women in Milan. I have eyed them. What's love about? It's masculinist judging of women's beauty. You know the theory of the time. If you were going to do a great painting, Vassario describes, doesn't he, the process by which you choose the most beautiful ear, the most perfect brow, the best nose, the most beautiful breasts, the loveliest arms, and you put together of all women the best that you can. It's a rather aesthetic kind of smorgasbord view of women that might be appropriate for a playboy. You know he's got a yellow Ferrari, don't you? He's been up and down the strip in Milan. He's seen all the prettiest girls. And what's he done? He's rated them. How does he see them, however? In fact, they're mermaids. What do? They're dangerous. He's the biggest catch in Naples. I'm sorry, not Milan. He's the biggest catch in Naples, isn't he? What does he say? Many a time the harmony of their tongues hath into bondage brought my too diligent ear. They weren't good enough for me. Bondage doesn't mean what you think it does. Don't snigger, please. But it's really funny, since he is her patient logman and he has wood for Miranda, that he's talking about having wood for all of these other women, and he didn't let it get him into trouble. He saw them as seductive mermaids, but he didn't listen to their rhetoric and the way they flattered him. He pushed them aside because he's holding out for the best. Which is lovely in a way, because who's he chosen? Not a princess, but some girl he meets on an island. So that's a good thing in his favour, isn't it? And yet, it goes on. For several virtues have I liked several women, never any with so full soul, but some defect in her. Does he have a checklist? Oh, yeah. Yeah, she has a really good body, but I'm afraid her dad only makes $30,000 a year. She lives in the wrong part of Naples. I really don't like false blondes. I mean, he's looked at a lot of them, he's judged a lot of women, and they haven't come up to the mark. Is this a really dreary patriarchal discourse that we've seen so often? What's the sad thing? She is a kind of fairy tale princess, but he is all too real, isn't he? We know the type. You can imagine when they get married, can't you? He's going to be driving his Ferrari. He's going to park it illegally outside the Duomo, isn't he? Because He's a prince. He can park where he likes. He's going to go up to the restaurant opposite and he's going to meet with his friends that he met at Eton. Their names are probably Simon, Hugo, and Harry and Jules. Am I being unfair? No, because he links up with Claudio and all these other sort of semi-disreputable princes that Shakespeare has presented us with. He has it both ways, Shakespeare, doesn't he? Are you happy with this speech? He says to her, I've had sex with a lot of women, but I want you. You, oh you, so perfect and so peerless. Rhetoric, 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 which is why Susanna cringed, are created of every creature's best. And some of you who came to that lesson know what that rhetorical vice is called, where you have created and creature, but you just change the grammatical form of it. And then you get a killer answer, don't you, girls? I do not know one of my sex. No woman's face remember. Save from my glass, mine own. Nor have I seen more that I may call men than you, good friend, and my dear father. How features are abroad, I am skilless of. Isn't that a great answer? What does she say? I'm really sorry, I'm not going to get this right. I've got to say it not in a horrible tone. She says it very sweetly. I'm really sorry I can't help you out here because I'm the only woman I've ever seen. So I have no idea if what you say is actually true, how I rate compared with all these other women. In a way, it's a put down of the fact that it's not really a compliment that he's rated her against all these other women he slept with. Do you see how gently she does it? And in her modest fairy tale world, she's lived alone all on the island, she just says, I can't judge that, and I'm not going to judge. I think that's rather generous of her. And then she goes on, nor have I seen more that I may call men. Oh, don't you just love her? He chose after sleeping with 50 women. It's probably more like 100. How did she choose? I've never seen another man, but I chose you straight away. It's said in such simple English, isn't it far better than his, you, oh you, so perfect and so peerless? Isn't her choice, in a way, more ideal, more romantic, more beautiful? I do think there is this strange difference between the people who crash into this world who are much more kind of spiky and flawed like us, and someone like Miranda who is more interesting and, shall I say, more intelligent than Ferdinand. Then it goes further. I love the way she calls him good friend. She's not going to say, you've got great eyebrows, but I don't like your jawline. She says, good friend, and my dear father. So who's he held up to? Yeah. Do you come up to Prospero? What are we thinking? Well, of course you don't come up to Prospero. So I think that's a very, very charming thing to say. And then she says, with her air, is it mock? Is it mock humour, or is it genuinely innocent? How features are abroad, I am skillless of, so I can't produce a catalogue of other men to compare you with. Is that a put down, or is that charmingly complimentary? You might be hideously ugly. You might be a warthog. I don't know. I don't have a catalogue of features. She is really intelligent, isn't she? But she doesn't say it in a mean way. It's all very gentle because she loves him. This is the cleverness of Shakespeare, but we can see that it's comedy. This is quite a funny scene if it's played very gently and not played all gung-ho as romantic gush. How features are abroad, I am skillless of, but by my modesty, the jewel in my dower, I would not wish any companion in the world but you. I do think that's a smackdown. I like this expression, smackdown. Why? In a Christian culture, they both should be virgins, shouldn't they? What did he say when he first met her?
In your
If you're a maid or no. And she's quite surprised by this. What he really means is, are you a real woman? But it also means, are you a virgin? And she answers the question. From the very first, there has been this problem, hasn't there? That there is a double standard. And here she says, but by my modesty, the jewel in my dower, because she just thinks, she's a poor girl on the island, though she's just found out her father is a duke. What does she offer? What can he offer? He's not going to offer his modesty, is he? Because he's just blown it by saying what kind of his sexual past is. I think it's very charming and innocent that she is aware of the double standard and she offers him her modesty. What's the other meaning of modesty? It's a genuine modesty. I don't know what men look like in the world. I just love you. What's he said? I love you because I've compared you with hundreds of other women. And why do I like you? Because you're perfect. Which part of her body is perfect? It's the hymen, isn't it? I shouldn't say that. But of course, an Elizabethan audience thinks about these things in a way that we don't, because we've come through the Victorian period. These are things that are glossed through here. I would not wish any companion in the world but you. Look at the words, friend and companion. This is a configuration of love that we would recognize in our fuzzy, warm American sitcom world, isn't it? And it's a world in a way that Shakespeare has created, that love means companionship, friendship, not just a flash-in-the-pan lust. I would not wish any companion in the world but you, nor can imagination form a shape besides yourself to like of. Well, did she outdo him in this speech? She couldn't in her imagination think of a human being that she could like more or who was more beautiful. You're never going to get a compliment like that in your entire life. Is he worthy of it, Lucy? As so often in Shakespeare, you feel possibly the women are of a higher caliber than the young men who marry them. Not always. That's not always true. I do feel that is true of this play. Still, will she be happy? I think so. As long as she doesn't have to put up with Hugo, Jules, Harry, and Simon too much. Nor can imagination form a shape beside yourself to like of, but I prattle something too wildly in my father's precepts I therein do forget. And her genuine modesty comes out there because she judged him. She talked about his physical appearance and she draws back from it as something that she shouldn't have done. And also her father's told her not to speak to him. Then, of course, where does he go? I am in my condition a prince, I do think a king, and would no more endure this wooden slavery than to suffer the flesh fly blow my mouth. Hear my soul speak. Is that attractive or not attractive? I wouldn't do this normally, babe. I've got a Ferrari. There is an ugly side to that. Could you please be aware Shakespeare presents a romance and it's very beautiful and very rarefied and very fairy tale-like, but it also has these real social issues that you have looked at over the course of this course in so many different ways. So please don't adopt a naive view of the complexities that are there. Was that interesting? So have a look anywhere in the text, and it is quite a complex and subtle play. Don't get carried away with the fairy tale view of it. I'd like to finally go back to Caliban. This passage is a good example. It's Act 2, Scene 2, I'll show thee best springs. This is a good example of the overlapping of Christian allegory and the ideas about colonialism, the New World, slavery and servitude. Do you remember The Merchant of Venice with Lancelot Gobbo getting a new master and all of the jokes about St. Paul becoming a new man, getting rid of the old man of the flesh and becoming a new man in the spirit? And in doing this, Caliban says he's going to get a new master and be a new creature. He ends with freedom, high day freedom. It's really sad and tragic because, as we've already said before, the obvious jokes are that he's mistaken a drunken butler for a god. This actually happened, didn't it? Do you know what happened when Cortez got to Mexico City? And they really thought it actually matched up with the prediction that strange white gods would come. And they'd have strange beasts, and they had horses, and they had blunderbusses, and there was an attribution of the semi-divine to Cortez and his men that allowed them to capture Moctezuma. And you know the great story about the gold? Moctezuma agreed to fill a room bigger than this with gold. And they got very excited. Can you imagine the floor covered with gold? But there was a mistranslation because Cortez was sleeping with a famous woman who actually slightly mistranslated what Moctezuma had said. So Moctezuma thought Cortez had said that it wasn't enough. So Moctezuma agreed to cover himself with gold so that they filled a much bigger room than this with gold objects, gold chalices, gold bars, gold coins, I don't know what, gold masks. Can you imagine a huge room filled 6 feet tall with gold? And that's what the ransom was brought by Moctezuma's people to free him. And of course, they did slaughter him anyway. He was murdered. They didn't let him go, but they did get the gold. So curiously, I always wonder this idea that Shakespeare brings that Caliban can't see. He actually can't see the goodness in Prospero, the ridiculousness in Trinculo, who sounds like a trinket, and Stephano. He can't see that they're drunken idiots. It is tragically a reflection on a lack of perception. And the peoples of the New World really did not see. There were strange misunderstandings in the South Pacific. People welcomed them all over the South Pacific, but things did go wrong. And you know that Captain Cook was speared in the Sandwich Islands when mistakes were made. Caliban does exactly what the people of the New World did. I'll show thee the best springs, I'll pluck thee berries, I'll fish for thee and get thee wood enough. This is what they did. They gave them jade, gold. They got all the riches of the earth. Where would we be, foodies of the Purcell School, without chocolate, vanilla, tomatoes, peppers, sweet corn? I think in a way Mexico has created all of the best things in the food world. And if you've been to Mexico, you will have the best food time imaginable. And that's what they did. They took so many things back from the New World. And of course, the people there were happy. Caliban continues the satire in a simple way. I'll show thee, I'll pluck thee, I'll fish for thee, and get thee wood enough. And all of the rather sad levels of willful degradation are presented. It goes from show thee to physical activity, pluck thee, to fish for thee, a more difficult thing, to finally get thee wood enough. I'll be carrying wood. And it shows the process by which these people became enslaved because their conquerors did take advantage of their gullibility and naivety, and they did end up working in this terrible way. Of course, this also satirizes the audience's perception, but the more intelligent members of the audience will be seeing what Shakespeare is presenting. Of course, what did many of the people think in the audience? This is what natives are for. Those people clean the toilets at Heathrow, and they must go on cleaning the toilets at Heathrow. Of course, we all want a better life. This is the difficulty in a hieratic society. But there is a perception that Indians should show, pluck, fish, and get thee wood. And even Stephano and Trinculo think this is completely normal. Even worse, we expect them to be happy doing it. I'm going back to grace. I'll seek for grace. Do we expect the lowest and poorest people to be grateful to us for what we give them? It is a continuing satire of the social views that are rather classist, racist, aristocratic in Shakespeare's audience. You are much more used to these things. A plague upon the tyrant that I serve. Well, I've said that Plato is everywhere, and Plato in the Republic produces a theory in which you go through cycles of kinds of government, and monarchies can easily degenerate into a state run by a tyrant. A plague upon the tyrant that I serve, I'll bear him no more sticks, but follow thee, thou wondrous man. And of course, the wondrous man is Pizarro Cortez. He's every colonizer who ever betrayed the trust of the people he initially contacted. A most ridiculous monster to make a wonder of a poor drunkard. Well, Trinculo, the half-fool, sees the truth. Who's the poor drunkard? It's Stefano, but it's also us, isn't it? I mean, it's all of us. We must be crazy to think, as Conrad shows us, we must be crazy to think we have the right to do this. Does a butler and a jester have the right to have a personal slave? Go back to the audience. They're thinking, these people are not allowed to have a slave. You know, in the Renaissance, you couldn't wear, if you were a poor person, pearls, ermine, beaver, any number of furs or precious materials, because it was a kind of impersonation of an aristocrat in the street. You could be arrested for wearing certain kinds of cloth. You know from the Merchant of Venice, the Jews had to wear gabardine in Venice. So even the things that you wore were controlled by law, so that you could not mistake a lord for an English teacher. I would be dressed in something that an English teacher, a schoolmaster, would wear. It would be black clothing with my lace would be small. It wouldn't be a big frilly thing. You can look at portraits of the time, and everyone has their degree in every aspect of their lives. So Shakespeare is in this weird triangle, looking at the ridiculous idea that Caliban is happy to take a new master, but the kinds of masters that we gave were woefully inadequate. How many Kurtzes went out as governors of small states and ran them in appallingly terrible ways? How many Pizarros and Cortezes slaughtered, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people? It's an interesting parody. Then Caliban goes on, I prithee let me bring thee where crabs grow, and I with my long nails will dig thee pig nuts, show thee jay's nest, and instruct thee how to ensnare the nimble marmoset. I'll bring thee to clustering filberts, and sometimes I'll get thee young scammels from the rock. Wilt thou go with me? Caliban, the horribly spitting, angry slave, turns out to be, in fact, what he might have been originally. Do you remember on Wednesday I said, is there a chance for rehabilitation? Is there a chance that Prospero could make this better? What happens? Can you see the depth of the irony? He meets two drunks, and which Caliban comes out? The Caliban so eager to please, to be positive, to be helpful, to have a better life. I'll do all this for you. It's a Caliban we hadn't previously seen. It was the Caliban that Prospero and Miranda originally met, and then it went wrong. Why could Prospero not get this Caliban back? Do you see what I mean? Why does a drunk and a fool bring this Caliban out again? This Caliban so willing to be helpful and to be positive to his new masters. Is it not a huge condemnation of European colonizers that they could not exploit in a way which didn't make these people eventually bitter, brutalized, hurt, and enslaved? Prithee, lead the way. Trinculo, the king and all our company, else being drowned, we will inherit here. Of course, it's a satire on inheritance, because who's the real king of the island? Caliban. It's Caliban's island because it was Sycorax's island, and he's her son. He's the king of this island. If you're going to joke about primogeniture and the divine right of kings, Caliban should be the king of the island. This continues the satire, of course. Follow Trinculo, we'll fill him by and by again. Also, do you know anything about the way fire water was used for the Indians in North America, for Aboriginal peoples in Australia? It turned out to be a terrible ill in parts of the world and was used even as a tool of enslavement. And this is brought up here. Farewell, master, farewell, farewell, a howling monster, a drunken monster. In the production you saw, was it sad or was it funny that it was funny that he's so excited and so happy?
They mock him and mimic his gestures.
So did they have it both ways, Fiona, that you felt sorry for him, or that you felt, wow, this could be a new Caliban, but tragically it's not going to work, is it? Because the people he is focusing on as his new masters are drunken idiots. And then he says, and this for me is very touching, no more dams I'll make for fish, nor fetch in firing at requiring, nor scrape trenchering, nor wash dish. This is a reverse of what he said. He's gone back to the earlier Caliban that agreed to show them things, get them things, but not be enslaved, making fish dams, carrying trenchers, fetching in wood. He's not going to wash dishes. He doesn't want to be enslaved. He wants to have a relationship with his new masters that is the same as the relationship he had with Prospero and Miranda at first, where he gets them things, shows them things, and is appreciated. Tragically, what he's been given here is alcohol, which is clouding his vision. And I think it's a condemnation of Prospero, isn't it? Caliban does not realize that, of course, a little bit down the track, Trinculo and Stefano will make him the slave of this commonwealth as well. He is going to be making dams for fish, fetching and firing. He's going to be trenchering and washing dishes. Does it always have to be like that? I think that's what Shakespeare's asking. Why is every colony that Europeans begin in the New World always going to be like this? Are there other models? So, in a funny kind of vignette, he presents these huge and complex problems. And finally, we get into the religious area. Ban, Caliban has a new master, get a new man. The religious allegory. Has he given up the old man of the flesh, and is he a new man in the spirit? No, it's not that spirit, is it? Which spirit is it? It's a spirit out of a bottle in a bitter, punning joke. His new spirit of optimism is fired up by alcohol, which blinds him to the real truth of how paltry his new masters actually are. He's not getting a new master he's not becoming a new man. There's no high day, there's no freedom. And the sad repetition drives the point home. And what is he? A brave monster. Oh, brave new world that has such people in it. What goodly creatures are there here? And we have a terrible parallel. When Miranda first sees these people, she says they're goodly creatures and they're brave people, but what does Prospero say bitterly? "'Tis new to thee," because he knows his foul brother and his foul friend are standing there. Miranda is just as innocent as Caliban, and the word brave, which occurs quite often in the play, strangely, Ariel uses it, and Prospero uses it of Ariel, Caliban and Miranda are linked up. I've gone over time and you have a barn dance to go to, so I shall stop there, and we're doing it at Monday. On Monday, are we? Yes. At 4 o'clock.